I stood there quietly, my hands steady on the teapot, as my own son laughed at the way I lived. She still uses coupons, he joked to his wife, the words sharp enough to slice through the steam. She lives like a beggar. He said it while sitting on my couch, drinking my tea, in a home he never paid. After raising him alone, after co-signing his first mortgage, after handing him my trust, he saw nothing but lack. I didn't argue. I just waited. And when the time was right, I slid the deed across the table to the apartment he thought he owned. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The chipped porcelain teapot let out a gentle sigh of steam as Margaret Maggie Lewis poured warm chamomile into mismatched cups. The air in her modest apartment smelled faintly of old books, lemons, and dust warmed by late sunlight. Her hands, steady despite the years, arranged slices of banana bread on a thrifted glass plate. It was a simple offering: tea, conversation, and maybe, if the mood allowed, a memory or Vanessa's stiletto heels clicked across the worn linoleum like an unwanted metronome. She barely glanced at the old lace curtains as she took a seat with the grace of someone trying not to touch anything. Is this vintage or just old? She asked, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve as she gestured to the floral couch. It's giving depression-era. Ethan chuckled, collapsing into the armchair, the swagger of someone who hadn't paid his own electric bill in a while. Ma's always had a thing for Anne, except she calls them sentimental. She lives like a beggar but won't sell any of it. Maybe the junk holds the walls up. Claire, perched on the edge of a milk crate coffee table, shot her mother a sharp look. Can we? Maybe not, she said quietly, fingers wrapped tightly around the warm ceramic. Her cheeks flushed, either from embarrassment or the radiator's late afternoon groan. Maggie, still by the kitchenette, didn't flinch. Her back remained straight, her lips set in a neutral. She picked up the last cup and crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, placing the tea in front of Vanessa with all the ceremony of a matron. I thought we could have a quiet visit, she said simply. Vanessa sipped, winced. No oat milk? Ethan laughed again. Ma's idea of luxury is real sugar. Claire stared into her tea like it might offer a portal elsewhere. Maggie sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Funny how taste changes with age, she said. Some people grow into it, others just grow louder. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, but Ethan missed the nuance. Well, not all of us can live in understated elegant, he said, glancing around at the wallpaper that had peeled back like curling leaves from one corner. Still can't believe you won't move into something nicer, you know, like a proper retirement place. A box with beige walls and a microwave menu? Maggie arched a brow. No thank you. Vanessa looked around with exaggerated. You could at least repaint, or get a better couch, or, I don't know, buy something new. I mean, we'd help, but, you know. She gestured vaguely as if the idea of charity might soil her manicure. Maggie smiled thinly. I do know. The silence grew heavy. Claire shifted, trying to change the current. Grandma, didn't you say you used to know the old architect who designed the Carnegie Library downtown? I did, Maggie said, grateful for the out. He had a thing for hidden doors. Like, in real buildings? Real building. Real secret. Vanessa sighed, bored already. Well, speaking of real, Ethan and I are touring a loft next downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished concrete, smart lighting. Not that you'd know what that is. Maggie sipped her tea. No, but I know what sunlight feels like in a room no one's pretending to own. Claire blinked. Vanessa raised a brow. What's that supposed to mean? It means the sun's free, but mortgages, not so much. Ethan glanced away. Moments later, the door clicked shut behind them. No goodbye, just the echo of boots and heels down the hallway. The apartment felt quieter without them. Not peaceful, just less There was a knock. Not hurried, familiar. Joan Fisher stepped inside, her silver hair tucked under a navy wool cap. Her coat was buttoned all wrong, as usual. I saw their car pull away, she said, voice tight. How bad was it? Maggie stood and began clearing the cups. The usual, wallpaper insult, furniture joke, moral superiority served lukewarm. Joan's eyes blazed. Those spoiled jackals don't know who they're laughing at. Maggie paused in the kitchen door, one hand on the light switch. Let them? Joan stared. You're really letting this slide? Maggie clicked the light off. The room dimmed to soft shadows and golden spill from the windows. They'll learn, she said softly. The kettle had long gone cold, but Maggie hadn't moved from the table. A thin line of steam rose from Joan's tea, untouched. The old friend sat across from her, arms folded, jaw tight, watching Maggie with that particular look she saved for things that made her blood boil. They mock you to your face, Joan said, voice low. And you pour them tea? Like it's communion. Maggie slid a coaster under a cup that didn't need one. Mockery only hurts when it hits the truth. Joan leaned forward. You're not poor, Maggie. They think you're living on prayer and pennies, and you just sit there letting them believe it. Maggie's eyes drifted toward the hallway. The light was softer now, amber sinking into shadows. They believe what they want. It costs me nothing. Joan's stare didn't. But it could cost you. You know what people like that do when they smell blood. Maggie didn't respond, not with words. Instead, she stood, walked quietly into her bedroom, and opened the closet door. Joan followed her, stopping in the threshold. The bedroom was neat, but lived in. A quilt folded at the foot of the bed. A narrow window cracked open just enough to let in the sea's breath. And in the closet, behind a row of cardigans and a dusty sewing machine, Maggie pulled out a hard plastic filing box. She clicked it open, and inside, carefully tabbed and color-coded, were records, neatly arranged, chronologically ordered, some yellowing at the edges, deeds, trust, notarized document, tax record, property title. Joan stepped closer. Good Lord. Maggie pulled one folder free and laid it gently on the bed. The top document bore the sleek steel and glass logo of Franklin Lofts, LLC, a downtown high-rise with luxury condos and a waiting list. The ownership field read, Margaret A. Lewis, Trustee Lewis Family Revocable Living Trust. Joan blinked. Wait, you? That's the place Ethan and Vanessa were bragging about? Maggie gave a small nod. Unit 9C, 9D, and the rooftop terrace. Bought them when the developer filed bankruptcy. Pennies on the dollar. Joan nearly sat down on the floor. You own 3 units in that building? 4? Maggie said quietly, pulling out another deed. One's vacant. 2 are rented. One's theirs. Joan stared at her like she'd grown wings. I thought you said you were just living off retirement and old library bond, Joan muttered. Maggie opened another file. And dividends. And rental income. And a bit of index fund luck. She smiled faintly. Rachel told me to keep everything in the trust. Said it was safer that way. Joan's mouth twitched. Rachel Stein? You brought her in on this? Maggie gave her a look. Rachel is sharper than a scalpel and quieter than a shadow. I pay her enough to stay both. They stood together in the silence for a long moment. Joan's eyes ran across the stacks of documents again. Why let them think you've got nothing? Why let them talk to you? Maggie looked down at the folder and her fingers trailed over the raised notary seal, a scar no one saw but her. Timing, she said softly. It's the only weapon they don't understand. She refiled the deed, tightened the plastic clasp, and placed the folder back into its assigned spot. The closet door closed with a quiet finality. Joan still looked like she had questions, but Maggie turned off the bedroom light before she could ask. They walked back into the living room. Streetlights outside flickered to life, casting long shadows across the floor. Want to stay for dinner? Maggie asked, like nothing had happened. Joan opened her mouth to answer, but her phone buzzed. She frowned, reading the script. It's Claire. Maggie's brow lifted. At this hour? Joan handed the phone over without speaking. Claire had texted only one sentence. Dad said something weird? About changing the lease? Should I be worried? Maggie's lips thinned and her thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't reply. Instead, she looked toward the closet. Maggie hesitated in front of the building's glass entrance, her breath catching as the autumn wind lifted the hem of her wool coat. She looked up. 30 stories of clean steel lines and mirrored glass rising against a slate-gray sky. Franklin Lofts had always struck her as soulless from the outside, but it paid handsomely for people who liked the illusion of prestige. Behind her, Ethan's voice cut through the street noise. It's not even on Zillow yet. Pre-market tour. Vanessa called in a favor. Maggie turned to see them approaching from the parking garage. Vanessa was dressed like she was going to brunch with a fashion editor. High boots, camel coat, gold hoops, and sunglasses too large for the cloudy day. Mother-in-law's first luxury tour, Vanessa said, as she reached for Maggie's elbow. Try not to faint from all the modernity. Maggie gave her a thin smile. I'll do my best. Inside, the lobby was all sharp lines and gleaming surfaces, minimalist art, faux marble, a scent diffuser pumping something eucalyptus adjacent into the air. I swear it smells expensive, Vanessa whispered to Ethan, loud enough to echo. The elevator ride was smooth and silent. Vanessa adjusted her reflection in the mirrored wall, while Ethan tapped at his phone. Penthouse level views, minus the penthouse price, he muttered. Only downside is the lease renewal. Rent's jumping. Maggie said nothing, though her eyes drifted to the digital floor indicator. 9th floor. Her floor. They stepped into Unit 9D. It was stunning. Exposed brick flanked one side of the open space, balanced by floor-to-ceiling windows on the other, casting a panorama of Pittsburgh's skyline in soft, industrial light. Recessed lighting floated above like constellations, and polished hardwood stretched in wide planks beneath their feet. A sleek kitchen island stood like sculpture in the center. Vanessa did a theatrical twirl. "Can't you just feel how much better your life would be here?" Ethan chuckled. No peeling wallpaper. No teacups from the Great Depression. Maggie walked in slowly, her gaze steady, not at the decor, but at the imperfection. The faint water stain near the recessed vent, the hinge on the coat closet that still squeaked, the exact corner where the terrazzo tile always buckled ever so slightly in the winter. She knew every inch. Vanessa was still rambling. "The property manager's name is Blake or something. Total professional, super punctual. He's even helping us negotiate down the deposit since we've been model tenant." She laughed like the concept amused her. As if summoned, a door at the far end of the hallway opened, and Andrew Blake stepped into the loft. Pressed shirt, black folder in hand, and an expression halfway between duty and recognition. "Mr. Lewis," he said to Ethan with a brisk nod. Then his eyes landed on Maggie. His face softened. "Mrs. Lewis, I didn't expect you this afternoon." Ethan blinked. "Wait, you two know each other?" Andrew smiled politely. "Yes, we've worked together before." Vanessa tilted her head. "Really? Doing what?" Maggie turned toward a window, letting the late light brush her face. "We've crossed paths," she said lightly. "A few buildings, here and there." Ethan frowned, his mouth opening to press further, but Andrew had already turned his attention to the folder. "Here are the current lease terms. You're up for renewal in 60 days. I've flagged the revised rent. Slightly above market due to demand." He handed it to Ethan, who glanced at the number and let out a low whistle. "They're really jacking it up, huh?" "Good buildings retain value," Maggie murmured. Vanessa, still too focused on her reflection in the black tile backsplash, didn't hear the undercurrent in her voice. Claire's text echoed in Maggie's mind. "Dad said something weird about changing the lease." She folded her hands, letting her thumb rest where the building's security key panel had once failed. She'd replaced it 2 years ago. This wasn't a tour. It was surveillance. The lease sat on Maggie's dining table, crisp and untouched, the legal language printed in that cold, detached font developers loved. She read it twice, then a third time, not out of confusion, but deliberation. Tenant name: Ethan T. Lewis, Vanessa M. Lewis. Unit: 9D. Franklin Lofts lease. Status: delinquent. 2 months. Notice of intent to increase rent. Pending signature. Maggie tapped her nail on the margin where Andrew had penciled in the proposed rent hike. It wasn't unfair. If anything, it was generous for the location, but Ethan and Vanessa were already in arrears. The arrogance of it made her stomach turn. They lived like royalty in a glass castle, throwing stones at her linoleum floor, all while dodging bills like they dodged accountability. She folded the lease carefully, slid it into a folder marked active, and reached for her phone. 2 rings. Rachel Stein. "It's Maggie. You have a minute?" "Always." Her attorney's voice was calm, clipped, efficient. A woman who read contracts like war maps. Maggie explained in steady detail the lease terms, the delinquency, the rising rent, the snide remarks disguised as social graces. When she paused, Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have full authority under the trust. If they're behind, you could file for eviction by Tuesday." Maggie looked toward her window, where the street below pulsed with early traffic and wet leaves clung to the curb. "No eviction." Rachel was silent. "Okay, then what?" "I don't want to push them out," Maggie said. "I want them to stay exactly where they are." Long enough to feel the floor vanish, Rachel's voice dipped lower, intrigued. "You're planning something?" Maggie allowed herself a small smile. "Something educational." "Well," Rachel said, "in that case, you can withhold lease renewal and send a compliance warning. Or better yet, delay it altogether. Keep them off balance." "I was thinking..." Maggie opened her planner, flipping to Sunday. "Dinner. My place. Ethan and Vanessa both. Claire too." Rachel laughed softly. "What are you going to serve? Justice?" Maggie's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just pot roast. And paperwork." She hung up and stood slowly. Her knees ached a little more these days, but her mind felt sharp as a blade pulled from ice. She walked to the hallway closet. Not the one with her coat, but the one with the lockbox inside. The folder labeled Franklin was now joined by another. This one containing the full ledger of tenant payment, a notarized list of trust assets, and the original deed transfer, complete with timestamps and her initials on every page. She slid both folders into her bag, zipping it shut with precision. In the mirror by the door, she adjusted the collar of her cardigan and gave herself a once-over. It was time. That evening, Maggie typed out the group text slowly. Sunday dinner. My place. 6 sharp. Nothing fancy. Would love to see you all. Claire responded in under a minute. I'll be there. Vanessa replied 2 hours later. What's the occasion? Maggie typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally sending, just family, and good timing. No reply. Maggie stood by the induction stove, spooning gravy into a porcelain boat older than Claire. The roast filled the loft with rich, grounding smells, garlic, thyme, browned onion. She moved with unhurried precision, sleeves rolled, apron tied, her breath even. Outside the massive windows, Pittsburgh's skyline shimmered in golden hour haze. From the hallway, she heard high heels clacking like punctuation. Vanessa entered first, head high, hair sculpted like it had a personal architect. You said dinner at a new place, she called out. So I assumed you were finally letting us upgrade you. This loft is, wow. Ethan followed, holding a bottle of overpriced Pinot like a peace offering. We had no idea you had friends in this building. Oh, Vanessa chimed in. Or are you house-sitting for someone? Because this is actually nice. Claire trailed in behind them, eyes immediately scanning the familiar walls. Her brow creased. Joan was already seated at the table, helping herself to olives. She looked like she'd been born to occupy sleek spaces, feet tucked under her, wine glass already half full, wearing a sweatshirt that said, "The system is rigged" in blocky black print. Welcome, Joan said cheerfully. You found it. Vanessa laughed. Well, Ethan already lives here. Or we do. Technically. She tossed her coat on the leather chaise. Maggie didn't even ask if it would be weird to host dinner in the same building. Joan sipped her wine. She's full of surprises lately. Ethan wandered over to the kitchen island, peering at the food. This roast smells insane, Ma. You didn't do all this yourself, did you? Maggie just smiled. Why don't you all take your seats? She carried the dishes out one by one. Slow-roasted carrots, garlic mashed potatoes, sourdough stuffing, a glass bowl of red wine poached pears glistening under the pendant lights. The table shimmered with quiet effort. Vanessa looked vaguely threatened by the homey elegance of it all. As they ate, Maggie asked gentle questions. Claire's midterm, Joan's physical therapy, even Ethan and Vanessa's latest real estate lead. She nodded, listened, refilled glasses like any loving host. Vanessa was halfway through her second helping of potatoes when she leaned back and sighed. Honestly, this building has spoiled me. I can't imagine going back to any of those. What did the agent call them? Transitional neighborhood. She laughed, fork dangling. Ethan grinned too. It's perfect for us, really. Stylish, walkable, great view. Rent's the only drag, Vanessa added. But Ethan's negotiating. He's good at these things. Maggie looked at Ethan across the table. Are you? She asked, voice gentle. Ethan straightened, glancing briefly at Vanessa before puffing his chest. Let's just say I know how to reposition a conversation. Maggie nodded, then reached beside her chair. She pulled out a slim manila folder and laid it carefully between the salt shaker and the butter dish. Nobody spoke. Joan raised one eyebrow, hiding her grin behind her wine glass. What's that? Vanessa asked, already suspicious. Maggie opened the flap and slid the first page out. Lease renewal. Franklin Loft. Unit 9D rent increase. Late fees noted. Owner's name. Margaret A. Lewis, trustee. Claire's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Ethan blinked. Wait, why do you have our lease? Maggie placed the second document on the table. A copy of the deed. Notarized. Dated. Clear as glass. I brought it, she said calmly, because I thought dinner was the right time. Vanessa scoffed. The right time for what? Maggie looked up at them, her voice quiet but utterly unshakable. You're standing in my property. The silence crashed like a cymbal. Vanessa laughed. A brittle, deflated sound. No. No, this unit is owned by some investment firm, Franklin something. Ethan. Tell her Ethan said nothing. Maggie tapped the deed. Franklin Lofts, LLC is a shell company, owned by the Lewis Family Revocable Trust, managed by me. Claire's eyes widened. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Vanessa stood up, then sat back down just as fast. This is a joke. It's not, Joan said, swirling her wine. I've seen the papers. I've read them twice. Ethan looked down at the lease renewal like it was written in fire. The table had gone cold, but the room had not. Ethan stared at the lease like he could rewrite it with sheer will. His jaw tightened, fingers twitching beside his wineglass. This, he started, his voice cracking. This has to be some kind of mistake. You don't own this building. Maggie didn't flinch. I do. Vanessa scoffed from across the table, her laugh jagged. Oh, come on. You live in a one-bedroom that smells like mothballs and librarian sadness. You're telling me you own a luxury high-rise? Maggie's gaze didn't waver. I'm telling you the truth. Whether you like the packaging is up to you. Ethan slapped the lease shut. Why didn't you say anything? You sat there for years letting us think. You told yourself a story, Maggie said, folding her napkin slowly. I just didn't correct it. Claire sat frozen in her chair, eyes wide and unblinking. The candlelight danced in her glass of water. You really own this whole building? Just 4 units, Maggie said. And the ground lease. That includes 9D, Joan grinned, leaning back in her chair like she was at a play with a front row seat. So, when you said she lives like a beggar, she said, turning to Vanessa, you were actually sitting in her penthouse. Vanessa stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. This is insane. You can't just spring something like this on people. Joan laughed under her breath. But you can insult her home and call her charity cases for years? That wasn't sprung? Vanessa looked ready to lunge across the table when a knock came at the door. A second later, it opened, and Andrew Blake stepped in, a thin leather binder tucked under one arm. His eyes immediately found Maggie. You asked me to stop by, he said, tone neutral but deferential. Right on time, Maggie said, standing. Andrew opened the binder and began pulling out documents, original lease agreements, tenant payment history, and the Franklin Lofts property certificate with Margaret A. Lewis, trustee, printed clearly at the bottom. I figured it would be helpful, he said, setting the stack down near Ethan. Ethan didn't touch it. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a glitching ventriloquist dummy. So, wait, what does this mean? Are we being evicted? Maggie looked at her. No. I have no plans to evict anyone, yet, but your lease is overdue, rent is behind, and you've never once reached out about it. Ethan's voice dropped to a hiss. You let us live here, knowing we were behind, just to humiliate us over dinner? Maggie stepped forward, quiet but firm. I let you live here because you're my son, but don't confuse grace with weakness. Ethan's face flushed red. You've been sitting on this, waiting. Like a snake in the grass, Claire finally spoke. Dad. He turned on her. What? She lied to all of us. For what? Some grand gotcha moment? That's sick. Maggie's expression didn't change. You called me a beggar. I was joking, he barked. Joan raised her glass. That joke aged like milk. Andrew, sensing the volatility, stepped back toward the door. I'll follow up with the revised lease paperwork tomorrow, Mrs. Lewis. Maggie nodded. Thank you, Andrew. He paused before leaving, glancing briefly at Ethan. You know, he said calmly, most tenants don't get this level of patience. And with that, he was gone. The silence that followed wasn't soft. It was sharpened glass underfoot. Vanessa turned to Ethan. You said we were renegotiating. I was, he snapped. I didn't know she owned the damn place. Claire looked at Maggie. Why now? Why tell us like this? Maggie picked up the manila folder and slid it back into her bag. Because timing, she said quietly, is everything. The morning light slanted in across the kitchen table, catching the edge of a steaming mug of black coffee and the dull metallic gleam of paperclips stacked in small, tidy piles. Maggie sat in her robe, reading glasses perched low, her fingers moving deliberately across each document, bank statement, trust activity logs, investment account ledgers, rent ledgers from the property management system. Every page printed, highlighted, and annotated. Her pen tapped once, twice, against the margin of a flagged withdrawal attempt, a flagged transfer request dated just 2 weeks prior. The amount, $14,500. Destination account, redacted. She picked up her phone and dialed. Rachel Stein. It's begun, Maggie said softly. Rachel didn't ask for clarification. You'll need to bring everything. Originals, scans, whatever you've got. If they're trying to touch your accounts, we file today. Maggie's voice stayed calm. It came from Ethan's bank, the one where I co-signed his first loan. He still had access to one of the old joint authorizations. I never revoked it because you trusted him, Rachel finished for her. You don't anymore. Maggie folded a document and slid it into a manila envelope. I've seen enough. Rachel's tone shifted. This qualifies as financial exploitation. I can file a petition with the court today. Expedite it if you want it. Probate will take it seriously. Especially with the trust. Maggie didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved to a picture on the bookshelf. Claire at age 8, sitting in her lap, both of them reading A Wrinkle in Time. Claire's eyes back then had been full of question. They still were. Do it, she said. Monday afternoon, Franklin Lofts, Unit 9. Claire sat on the floor, half hidden behind the oversized sectional, pretending to scroll her phone while her parents argued in the next room. Vanessa's voice cut sharp through the air like glass snapping under pressure. You said she'd never find out. You said the trust was locked. I didn't touch the trust, Ethan snapped. It was an old account. And it was just sitting there. You forged her name? It was my name on that withdrawal request. I didn't forge anything. Claire's chest tightened. She didn't breathe. The carpet felt like it might swallow her. Vanessa's voice dropped to a hiss. She's going to come after us. You humiliated us. I have friends in this building. You wanted the lifestyle. I gave it to you. No, Vanessa spat. You borrowed it. Claire's thumb hovered over her screen. She tapped open a blank message to Maggie, then stopped. She needed to hear. Monday evening, Maggie's apartment. Joan sat on the couch, flipping through a folder Rachel had delivered earlier that day. Holy hell, she muttered. He tried to drain you. Maggie was quiet, organizing receipts by date. Her movements were unhurried, ritualistic. I gave him trust. He gave me a receipt for it. Joan looked. You going to tell Claire? I'm going to let Claire find her own way to the truth. A beat. Snakes turn on each other when cornered, Joan said. Maggie didn't look up. Good, she said, smoothing a crease in the folder. Let them bite. Joan's grin was tight, sharp. You're colder than I thought. I'm precise, Maggie corrected. Cold wastes energy. There was a knock at the door. Rachel stepped in, hair pulled back, heels clicking like punctuation. She handed over a thick manila envelope. Filed, Allegheny County, financial exploitation, breach of fiduciary trust, attempted fraud. Maggie accepted it without ceremony. They'll get served by Friday, Rachel added. If Ethan doesn't respond, we go straight to the judge. Maggie didn't smile, but she did nod. The courtroom smelled faintly of furniture polish and cheap coffee. Maggie sat at the petitioner's table, her hands folded over a thin stack of documents. She wore a navy blouse and a quiet expression. Rachel Stein sat beside her, black legal pad open, pen already moving before the hearing was gavelled in. Across the aisle, Ethan slouched in, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the door Vanessa sat beside him in a tailored blazer and too much perfume, legs crossed, heel bouncing impatiently. Neither looked at Maggie. The bailiff called it to order. Judge Howard Monroe entered, early 60s, thick glasses, reputation for being no nonsense. He flipped through a case file as he sat, eyes scanning line after line until he looked up directly at Maggie. Mrs. Lewis, you're the petitioner in this matter? I am, Your Honor, Maggie said even, alleging financial exploitation, unauthorized withdrawal attempts, and misrepresentation of trust assets? Yes, sir. Monroe looked at Ethan. And you're the respondent? Ethan stood, buttoned a jacket he hadn't worn since his last job interview. That's correct, Your Honor. And if I may say, these accusations are completely My mother has been confused. She's elderly. She forgets things. She's making a mess out of something she doesn't understand. Maggie didn't blink. Rachel stood. Your Honor, may I submit into record exhibits A through H, notarized property deeds, trust ledgers, financial account statements, and a forensic audit of the attempted transfer, executed from an account with Ethan Lewis's digital authorization. Judge Monroe adjusted his glasses. You're saying the son accessed trust-related accounts without written consent? Rachel didn't flinch. Correct. The attempt was caught by the bank's fraud alert system. No funds were moved, but intent was clear. Ethan scoffed. That's not fraud. It's a misunderstanding. I was listed as a co-authorized user years ago. It's not like I broke in. Monroe turned a page, except the account was restructured into a trust 3 years ago, which legally revokes your rights unless reauthorized. You didn't file for that. Vanessa leaned toward Ethan, hissing something under her breath. He waved her off. Let's keep decorum, Monroe warned, not looking up. Rachel stood again. We also have testimony from Mr. Andrew Blake, property manager of Franklin Lofts. He can confirm Mrs. Lewis actively manages multiple properties and handles her affairs without assistance. Andrew stepped forward, calm, buttoned down. He took the stand like he'd done it before. Margaret Lewis is the most meticulous owner I've worked with. Every form, every maintenance request, every ledger, we run it all through her office. She knows every square foot of her. She's no figurehead. Monroe scribbled something. Vanessa exhaled, sharp and theatrical. This is ridiculous. Excuse me? The judge asked. Vanessa stood. We're here being accused like criminals because she pointed at Maggie, decided to play Monopoly in real life. She lives like a hoarder and then suddenly she's real estate royalty? How does that make sense? Rachel turned slightly, calm. Your Honor, may the record reflect that the respondent's spouse just called the petitioner a hoarder. Monroe didn't look up. It's in the transcript already. Claire, seated quietly near the back, squeezed her bag tighter in her lap. Her face burned, but she stayed silent. As the judge continued scanning the files, Maggie turned slightly in her chair and met Claire's gaze. No word, just a look. Trust, steady, unbroken. Monroe finally looked up. Mrs. Lewis, do you feel you're being subjected to undue pressure by your son? Maggie didn't hesitate. He underestimated me. That's not pressure. That's poor judgment. A low chuckle rippled through the gallery before Monroe shut it down with a glance. He folded the file shut. I'll review the full documentation and issue my findings in writing. Given the nature of the allegation, temporary control over the trust and its accounts will remain with the Mr. Lewis, you are not to attempt to access, or inquire about trust finances until this matter. Ethan looked ready to punch a wall. Claire stood slowly as the hearing adjourned, walking toward Maggie in the hall. I didn't know, she said, voice low. I know you didn't, Maggie said gently. You're doing all this alone? Maggie smiled faintly. They're collapsing without my time. The click of the blinds being drawn was the only sound in the room for a moment. Rachel closed them herself before sitting down across from Maggie and Joan, a thick binder open in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, but the tabs lining the pages were color-coded and aggressive. Maggie stirred her tea slowly, not looking. Joan, legs crossed, leaned forward like she was watching a slow-motion train derailment. Rachel tapped the first page. Let's start with the credit card. The spreadsheet was merciless. 7 open lines of credit, 5 max, 1 in collection, 1 frozen for suspected fraud. Total revolving debt, $89,000, Rachel said. Not including interest. Joan let out a low whistle. So he's been living like a prince on borrowed time. Rachel turned the page. This is where it gets ugly. Ethan's tax record, 3 years of back filings, multiple flags from the IRS, and a pending audit. He filed for an extension last year, Rachel added. Then never filed. Penalties are accruing. This is why he came after the trust. He needed liquidity. Fast. Maggie didn't react. She simply sipped her tea. Joan, though, leaned forward. And Vanessa? Rachel opened a separate folder. Thinner, but no less damning. Multiple luxury purchases in her jewelry, handbags, travel. 2 trips to Miami in 6 months. First-class airfare. All charged to joint accounts. No income of her own. Joan barked a dry laugh. Living like royalty, but no castle. Rachel closed the folder. This wasn't about misunderstanding Maggie. They weren't confused. They were drowning, and they saw your name as a lifeboat. Maggie set her teacup down. They wanted my assets to bail them out. Rachel nodded. Exactly. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then, now everyone knows. Wednesday, cafe near the courthouse. The espresso machine hissed as Ethan slid into a booth across from Vanessa, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked near his temple. You told your sister we were planning to move to LA? He hissed. Vanessa didn't look up from her phone. She asked. I answered. He leaned in. You think people don't talk? You think Maggie's not tracking every leak now? I don't care what she's tracking, Vanessa snapped, still scrolling. She made a fool of us in court. She wants a war, she's got one. Ethan gripped the edge of the table. You maxed the Amex on handbags. Handbags. She glanced up, eyes narrowing. And you tried to steal from your mother. Which one of us do you think Claire's going to forgive first? He stood abruptly, knocking over a water glass. It shattered. People turned to look. He left it on. Wednesday night, Maggie's apartment. Joan dropped the newspaper onto Maggie's kitchen table. Local heir accused of financial abuse. Mother files in probate court. Maggie's face remained still, only her fingers smoothing the paper flat. The headline glared, bold and final. Below it, a grainy photo of Ethan outside the courthouse, jaw set, eyes dark. Vanessa trailing behind him in oversized sunglasses. "They'll hate you for this," Joan said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You know that, right?" "They already do," Maggie said. "But now they're losing publicly." Joan raised her mug. To that, Maggie didn't toast, but she didn't stop her either. A moment later, her landline rang. Rachel's voice came sharp through the static. The forensic handwriting report came back. "And? The signature on the property transfer wasn't yours." Joan froze. Rachel continued. "It wasn't Ethan's either." Rachel arrived early, she always did. But today, she was 15 minutes earlier than usual, and she wore black. Not the subdued charcoal of legal strategy, but courtroom black, war color. Maggie noticed it immediately. "They filed something," Rachel said as soon as she sat. "A supplemental motion. It came in late last night. We got the clerk to fast-track review this morning." Maggie folded her hands on the table. "And?" Rachel slid a copy across the table. "It's a property transfer dated 3 months ago. It claims you voluntarily reassigned the Franklin Lofts ownership to E." Maggie didn't touch it. "I never signed that." Rachel nodded. "I know. The ink was still fresh. The notary signature doesn't match the register. They didn't even backdate it." Joan muttered under her breath from the row behind. "They forged it." Rachel looked at Maggie. "I'm requesting an immediate forensic review." 30 minutes later, courtroom in session. Judge Monroe adjusted his glasses and looked down at the 2 exhibits in front of him. One was Maggie's original property deed, stamped, witnessed, notarized, and filed. The other, filed by Ethan's lawyer in an 11th hour motion, claimed transfer of ownership based on a family arrangement. "I find it troubling," Monroe said slowly, "that such a significant transfer happened under no court supervision, with no documentation until now." Ethan, seated next to a defense attorney who looked like he hadn't been fully briefed, tried to look both calm and indignant. "It was private, Your Honor. A verbal agreement. My mother and I discussed—" "Your Honor," Rachel interrupted smoothly. "We've submitted 2 certified handwriting Mrs. Lewis, along with the form filed last night, which we believe to be forged." Judge Monroe glanced at the forensic expert sitting quietly in the front row. "Mr. Doyle, you've examined these?" The examiner stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The signature on the new deed does not match any verified sample from Mrs. Lewis. Line pressure, angle, curvature, all inconsistent. Further, the notary signature appears to be fabricated. No such notary is licensed in Allegheny." A ripple went through the courtroom. Vanessa stiffened. Rachel didn't smile, but her pen stilled on the legal pad. Judge Monroe looked directly at— "Are you claiming your mother signed this document?" Ethan opened his mouth, then shut it. Vanessa leaned in, whispered something. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Lewis, excuse me, Ms. Lewis, do you have something to add?" She sat up straighter, voice suddenly sharp. "I didn't forge anything. I didn't even see the document until this morning. Ethan told me it was already signed." Maggie blinked slowly. Rachel, quietly, noted the shift. "For the record, Your Honor, the respondent's spouse just denied any foreknowledge of the filing." "Duly noted," Monroe replied. Ethan flushed. "We were both under the impression—" "Stop!" Vanessa snapped, loud enough to echo. "Don't include me in your idea." The courtroom hushed. Ethan turned to her in disbelief. "You're really going to do this right now?" "I didn't forge your mother's name," Vanessa hit. "You needed the property. You had access to the files. You said she wouldn't press charges, that she couldn't." Joan murmured behind Maggie, "And the snakes start to bite." Judge Monroe held up a hand. "Enough." His voice carried like a gavel before the actual one struck. "I'm considering contempt charges. At the very least, this filing qualifies as attempted fraud. The only reason I'm not ruling today is because I'm giving the district attorney's office a review. This is no longer just a probate dispute. It's bordering on criminal." He looked to Rachel. "Until further notice, the trust remains under full protection. No financial or property rights are to transfer or be contested without court approval." Then to Ethan, "And if you file one more false document, one more, I'll see you held personally liable." Ethan stared at the table like it might swallow him whole. Vanessa stared straight ahead, frozen. Outside the courthouse steps, reporters hovered at the base of the stairs. Maggie stood tall, cardigan buttoned, leather purse hanging neatly from her shoulder. She turned her face slightly as cameras clicked, not smiling, but not hiding. Behind her, Ethan and Vanessa argued in hushed tones, each throwing blame like cards in a losing game. Claire appeared at the edge of the crowd and quietly moved beside Maggie. "They're unraveling," she whispered. Maggie's voice was soft. "They already have." Vanessa slammed the apartment door shut behind her, ripping off her sunglasses like they'd burned her face. She threw her bag onto the floor, ignored the splash of perfume that broke in the impact, and stalked straight to Ethan, who sat motionless at the dining table, still in yesterday's wrinkled button-down. "They're going to indict you," she snapped. Ethan didn't answer. Vanessa grabbed his phone off the table and shoved it at him. "Check your email." The DA's office sent a letter of intent. "They're building their case." He looked at the screen but didn't take the phone. "They can't prove I forged anything." "You filed the document," she shouted. "You submitted it to the court, Ethan. You signed it. And now I'm in the transcript," quoted. "They'll never go through with it," he muttered. "We can settle. We'll say it was a misunderstanding." Vanessa stepped back and laughed, sharp and hollow. "You think she's going to settle now? Maggie wants to bury us. She's not your sweet little library mouse anymore." Ethan stood up, face flushing. "Then what do you want me to do? Grovel? Apologize? Crawl?" Vanessa crossed her arms. "No, I want you to fix it later that evening. Maggie's apartment." There was a knock. Not sharp, not defiant, just tired. Maggie opened the door slowly, already knowing. Vanessa stood there, alone. No makeup, hair pulled back, a long coat over leggings and running shoes. The illusion had finally cracked. "5 minutes," Vanessa said quietly. "Please." Maggie stepped aside, didn't speak. They sat at the table. Vanessa looked around the modest apartment like she was seeing it for the first time, not judging it, just taking it in. The wallpaper, the overwatered plant on the windowsill, the worn rug beneath her feet. "I was angry," she began. "I still am. But I'm also scared. I know what happens to people who lose everything. They get forgotten." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "I didn't forget you." Vanessa blinked fast, fighting emotion. "Ethan is spiraling. He's drinking. He's talking about suing you. Claire won't come home. We're barely speaking. You're afraid." Maggie finished gently. Vanessa nodded. "I'm not here to beg. But if there's any version of this where we don't end up in court, please, tell me." Maggie looked at her, long and steady. "There is," she said. Vanessa leaned forward, hope flickering like a match. "You could have told the truth," Maggie said. 3 months ago, 6 months ago, at my table. But you didn't. And now the court deserves to hear it." Vanessa's jaw trembled. "You want to ruin us." Maggie stood and poured 2 cups of tea. "I want to remind you that what you tried to take wasn't money. It was dignity." She set 1 cup in front of Vanessa. "And that's earned, not stolen." Vanessa didn't drink. She stood up slowly, her eyes glassy. "No deal?" she asked. "No compromise," Maggie replied. Vanessa left without another word. Saturday, Claire's college dorm. Claire watched her mother's texts come in and didn't answer. Then Ethan tried to call. She blocked the number. A moment later, another came through. From Maggie. "Just checking in." Claire replied, "I'm okay. Just needed distance. I love you." Saturday night, Joan's apartment. "Are you sure about this?" Joan asked, scanning the packet on the coffee table. Rachel nodded. "It's legal, airtight, and within Maggie's right as trustee." Joan turned to her. "And you're really filing it?" Maggie stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the wind lift leaves from the sidewalk below. "I am." Rachel slid the papers back into her bag. "By Monday, Ethan will be officially disinherited. The trust will bypass him completely. Claire stays in. Everything else reverts to Charity or Rachel's control until Maggie decides otherwise." Joan raised an eyebrow. "And you think he's hit bottom now?" Maggie turned, voice soft. "He hasn't even seen bottom yet." Joan poured whiskey into 2 tumblers. "Truth doesn't bend." Maggie lifted her glass. "But it does echo." They clinked. "Elder fraud scandal hits Franklin Lofts. Prominent Pittsburgh property owner files exploitation and forgery case against son and daughter-in-law." A grainy photo captured Maggie stepping down the courthouse stairs, flanked by Rachel Stein on one side and Joan on the other. Maggie's expression was calm, unsmiling, almost serene, an anchor in the middle of a story storm. Claire read the article over breakfast at a campus cafe, her phone buzzing nonstop with classmates asking, "Is that your grandma? Is it true? That's actually kind of badass." She didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she texted Maggie, "Can I come over this week? Just for a few days? I miss you." Tuesday, Franklin Lofts. Elevator. Two men in custom suits entered just as Ethan stepped in. One nodded stiffly, the other avoided eye contact altogether. By the time Ethan reached the 9th floor, a message had landed in his inbox. Subject: termination of consulting contract. "We regret to inform you." He didn't finish reading. At least 3 real estate blogs had already picked up the Gazette piece. His name was trending locally, for all the wrong reasons. Wednesday, Vanessa's Instagram. She posted a throwback of a Miami poolside brunch with the caption, "Manifesting peace, #positive vibes, only, #reset." The comments were less curated. "You exploited your own family? Hope peace comes with prison. Respect is the real luxury, babe." She turned off comments by noon. Thursday afternoon, Maggie's apartment. The spare room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old lavender sachets. Joan fluffed a pillow and stepped back to admire the bed. "Okay, it's not fancy, but it's soft, clean," and facing the good window, Maggie stood in the doorway with a small stack of folded sheets. "She used to love that window," she said. "Said the sun hit it like a spotlight in the morning." Joan smiled. "Well, it's hers again." Claire's suitcase rested by the dresser. Her jacket hung from the doorknob. In the corner, her old stuffed bear, recovered from Maggie's attic, sat on the nightstand like a sentinel. Claire emerged from the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, holding a chipped mug. "The tea tastes better here." "It's the water pressure," Joan joked. Claire smiled, and Maggie watched her with a look so soft it could have broken glass. Later that evening, Maggie's living room. Rachel sat with her legs crossed on the arm of the couch, thumbing through her tablet as Maggie flipped through the Gazette again. "It's surreal," Maggie said, not looking up. "Seeing my name printed like I matter." "You always mattered," Rachel replied. "The rest of the city just needed time to catch up." Joan chimed in from the kitchen, "And a forged deed didn't hurt." They all laughed, the kind that comes from fatigue and release. Rachel's tone shifted as she set the tablet down. "You know the judge is already leaning your way. The DA will file charges before the next hearing. This," she gestured around the room, at the stillness Maggie had reclaimed, "this is the win." Maggie folded the paper carefully and looked toward the kitchen window, where a breeze was teasing the lace curtain. "The court gave me time," she said quietly, "but the world gave me the truth." Rachel leaned forward. "So what now?" Maggie smiled. "Small. Private." "I plant flowers?" Rachel blinked. "What?" "Tomorrow. In the park. Joan and I. Claire if she wants." She stood, stretching slightly. People forget dirt heals. The courtroom was still before the judge even entered, but the stillness wasn't peace. It was pressure. The kind that hangs just beneath the skin, waiting to break. Maggie sat at the petitioner's table in a dark gray sweater, her shoulders squared and hands folded neatly over a slim folder. She didn't move. Not when the bailiff called the room to order. Not when Ethan walked in, trailing the scent of cold cologne and courtroom nerves. Not even when Vanessa made a show of her entrance. Black heels, black blazer, a silence so loud it might as well have been a scream. Rachel Stein stood beside Maggie, checking one last tab in her binder. Her voice, when she leaned in to whisper, was calm and absolute. "Whatever happens today, it doesn't define you," Maggie replied without looking away from the bench. "It defines them." A door opened. The court rose. Judge Monroe entered, his expression unreadable behind thick glasses and the weight of months of filings, hearings, accusations, and evidence. He moved slowly as he took his seat, but his gaze moved quickly, from Maggie to Ethan, from Vanessa to the press gallery now quietly filling with reporters and city observers. His gavel struck once. "This court is prepared to issue a ruling. No preamble, no delay." He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and opened the folder in front of him. "This case has presented us with an intersection of family, law, and fiduciary responsibility. At its core, it is not simply about property, but about trust, legal trust, personal trust, and the breach of both." Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight his cheeks twitched. Vanessa crossed her arms. Her nails were bitten short. Monroe continued, voice steady but carrying. It is the court's finding that the property in question, namely the 4 units and ground lease held under the Franklin Lofts LLC, is rightfully and lawfully owned by the Lewis Family Revocable Living Trust. The trust was properly established. The transfer of assets to the trust was executed with full legal authority. No evidence presented has challenged that foundation. Rachel exhaled quietly. Maggie remained still. The attempted withdrawal of funds by the respondent, Ethan Lewis, from a trust-linked account, without proper authorization, constitutes a breach of fiduciary expectation. While the funds were not successfully moved, the intent and method of access demonstrate willful exploitation. He turned a page. Further, the submission of a forged deed, fraudulently claiming voluntary transfer of property, constitutes an attempt to subvert legal ownership. Forensic analysis, expert testimony, and documentation all point to premeditated misrepresentation. Ethan flinched. Vanessa shifted in her chair, her eyes darting toward him, then away. Monroe looked at them both. As such, this court formally finds both Ethan Lewis and Vanessa Lewis complicit in an attempted act of financial exploitation and document forgery. While criminal proceedings may follow at the discretion of the district attorney, this court's ruling is civil in nature. The gavel remained untouched, but the words hit harder than wood. Inheritance rights previously afforded to the respondent, Ethan Lewis, under the Lewis Family Trust are hereby revoked. A sharp breath escaped Ethan's lungs, audible even across the courtroom. Vanessa's eyes widened, not in shock, but calculation. Restitution is ordered in the amount of $34,600 for legal fees, forensic investigations, and related administrative costs. Payment is expected within 60 days. Any failure to comply will result in a lien placed against personal property and future earnings. There were no protests, just silence, and the sound of the judge turning the final page. This case is concluded. The gavel came down once, final, clear, inescapable. Outside, courthouse steps, 10:06 a.m. The media lights were waiting, but Maggie ignored them. Claire reached her first, wrapping both arms around her grandmother and burying her face into Maggie's shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Maggie's arms tightened, just slightly. "It's done," she whispered. Rachel stayed close but gave them space. Joan caught up next, stepping in just long enough to squeeze Maggie's shoulder. "Well, look at that," she said with a smile that knew too much. "Beggar, huh?" Maggie turned toward her, lips curved in the smallest, quietest smirk. "No," she said softly. "Landlord." They descended the steps slowly, one generation supporting another, while behind them, Ethan stood near the columned entryway, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and frantic. Vanessa had already stepped into a waiting rideshare, her sunglasses back on, her face turned away from the camera, but the story had already been written, and this time, Maggie owned the page. The scent of caramelized onions drifted lazily through the small kitchen, mingling with the sharp brightness of lemon zest and the earthiness of roasted garlic. The stovetop hummed with quiet confidence, and Maggie moved through the space with practiced ease. Barefoot, sleeves pushed to her elbows, apron faintly dusted with flour. Outside the windows, the city glowed gold and glass. The skyline shimmered, softened by dusk. But inside, everything was anchored in warmth. The table was modest, no centerpiece, no crystal glasses, just mismatched plates, cloth napkins that had been folded and refolded over the years, and the kind of meal that made you feel safe before you ever took a bite. Claire arrived first, cheeks flushed from the walkover, her hair tied up with a pencil like she always used to when studying. She stepped inside and stopped for a moment, letting the warmth of the room sink into her. "It smells like you," she said, smiling. Maggie turned from the stove. "I'm not sure whether to thank you or check my deodorant." Claire laughed and wrapped her arms around her grandmother, pressing her face into Maggie's shoulder like she had so many times as a little girl. "This is home," she whispered. Maggie held her for a long moment. It always was. Joan and Rachel arrived together, both carrying something, a bottle of wine, a still warm pie. Joan kicked off her boots without asking, and immediately began helping herself to olives from the kitchen counter. "I told you I wasn't dressing up," she said, eyeing Rachel's blazer. "And yet, here you are." Looking like cross-examination incarnate, Rachel shrugged. amused. I like structure. Even on Fridays, I like sweatpants and wine, Joan replied. God bless America. They settled in easily. There was no formal toast, no dramatic reflection on the weeks behind them, just the soft clatter of forks and spoons, the occasional sound of glasses touching, and the kind of laughter that doesn't ask permission. Maggie served lentil soup, hearty, peppered just right, alongside a rustic loaf of bread Joan had picked up from a bakery that still took cash. There was a salad with fresh dill and feta, and for dessert, poached pears with cinnamon and honey. Claire paused after her first few bites, looking down at her bowl, then across the table. I've eaten in a lot of places that were supposed to feel fancy, she said, but nothing ever tasted this good. Rachel raised her brow. It's very good soup, Claire, but let's not start writing poetry about legumes, Claire smiled. No, I mean it. It's not the food, really, it's just… She looked around the table. This feels like something solid. Maggie met her eyes and nodded. Respect, she said softly. Tastes better than roast. Joan raised her wineglass in mock solemnity. To dignity stew. They all laughed. There was a knock at the door just after dessert. Maggie opened it to find Nancy from 7B, holding a bouquet of lilies and eucalyptus wrapped in brown paper. She looked slightly breathless, like she'd debated coming up and then rushed at the last minute. I didn't want to intrude, Nancy said, but I saw the article. I wanted to say thank you for standing up, for reminding the rest of us that quiet doesn't mean weak. Maggie took the flowers and smiled with genuine warmth. You're always welcome here. Nancy hesitated, then squeezed Maggie's hand and slipped back into the hallway. Later, after dishes were washed and put away, after Joan had left with a half-eaten pie and a sleepy wave, after Rachel had double-checked Maggie's door locks like the lawyer-mother-friend hybrid she was, Maggie and Claire sat on the sofa with their legs tucked under them and mugs of peppermint tea in hand. The city murmured outside, but the apartment was quiet. Still. Claire leaned her head against Maggie's shoulder. You okay? She asked. Maggie took a slow breath in, then let it out, eyes closed. For the first time in a very long time, she said, yes. And in that moment, surrounded by softness and steam, she believed it. Saturday evening, Community Hall, South Oakland. The folding chairs weren't glamorous, the carpet had seen better decades, and the podium wobbled slightly if you leaned too hard. But the hall was full. Every seat taken, people stood along the walls, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Students, retirees, small business owners, tenants, even a few curious realtors. The banner behind the stage was modest, voices of quiet power, a local conversation on ownership, dignity, and housing justice. Maggie stood backstage, smoothing the hem of her blazer. It was navy, sharp and clean, borrowed from Joan, who had insisted. No cardigans tonight, she'd said. This time, they need to see the spine. Claire stood beside her, holding a glass of water and 2 tissues balled in her hand, just in case. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her presence was enough. The moderator called Maggie's name, and the applause was warm, immediate, and strangely reverent, like the crowd knew they were about to hear something they'd feel before they understood. She stepped up to the mic, adjusted it carefully, and paused. The room fell into hush. I used to sit in rooms like this, she began, only in the back. Never up front. Never on the mic. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Maggie let her gaze scan the crowd, gently, slowly, like she was gathering courage not from the stage, but from the people watching. I used to believe that ownership looked like status, like Polish, like how many zeros you could stack after your name. But the truth is, ownership looks like silence sometimes, like choosing not to explain yourself, like taking notes when they call you names. She glanced toward the front row where Rachel sat beside Joan, both still and listening hard. For years I was mocked in my own family, called a beggar, pitied for my quiet life, for my small apartment, for the casseroles and coupons and floor fans in July. Another low chuckle. Nods from more than a few women. But what they didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, is that the building they stood in, the one they bragged about to their friends, the unit with the corner windows and the overpriced backsplash. She paused. No rush, just air and time. I owned it. A wave of murmurs, then silence again. I owned it while they ridiculed me. I maintained it while they ignored me. And when the time came to remind them whose name was on the deed, I didn't raise my voice. I raised a folder. Now the laughter came, fuller this time, real. And I'm telling you this not to brag, but because I want every person in this room who's ever been underestimated to know, quiet doesn't mean weak. Deliberate isn't the same as passive, and power doesn't always wear a tie. The applause started soft, but it grew. Row by row, people clapped, not politely, but with a kind of gratitude that felt personal. Claire wiped at her eye and tried not to be obvious about it. Joan leaned toward her and whispered with a grin, from mocked to admired. Maggie held up one hand, stilling the applause. "I'll leave you with this," she said. "Home isn't square footage. It's not who built the walls or how high the ceilings go. Home is where you're respected, where your boundaries are honored, where no one laughs at your dignity." Her voice didn't shake, but it dipped lower, more intimate. And when I handed them the lease to where they were standing, she waited a beat, just one. Their laughter died first, silent, and then the room rose, not in chaos but reverence, a standing ovation, loud, and long and deeply earned. Maggie stepped back from the mic, her posture steady, her hands loose by her side, vindicated and unshakably whole.